Today on Pilgrim Radio's His People, Zach Mettler on the faith foundation of the United States.
By Christian nation, what I mean is that America was founded on Christian principles. It was rooted in Christian ideas. Many of the founding fathers were faithful Christians, Orthodox Christians, and you cannot understand the founding of America, you cannot understand the founding of our nation without understanding the unique and singular contribution that the Christian religion, Christianity, the Christian faith had upon our nation, upon our nation's founding.
Zach Mettler next. Zach Mettler, a writer and issues analyst for the Daily Citizen, says you can't fully understand the American founding without acknowledging Christianity's essential and foundational role. Spencer Dalke is with Zach Mettler to discuss this topic. Additionally, Zach is the narrator for the new short film, Faith in America.
A lot of people talk about America, and there is debate on whether or not it was founded as a Christian nation. It's an ambiguous term, a vague term. What do we mean by that?
As you said, defining terms is very, very important because I think, especially with this issue, you ask basically anybody on the street, was America founded as a Christian nation? And they're going to have an opinion on either side of that issue, one side or the other. Some people like the ACLU or the Freedom from Religion Foundation will say, absolutely not. All the founding fathers were deists or atheists. None of them were Christians. On the other side, you have people who, would say, you have to be a Christian to be a citizen of the nation. That's not really true either. And by Christian nation, what I mean is that America was founded on Christian principles. It was rooted in Christian ideas. Many of the founding fathers were faithful Christians, Orthodox Christians. And you cannot understand the founding of America, you cannot understand the founding of our nation without understanding the unique and singular contribution that the Christian religion, Christianity, the Christian faith had upon our nation, upon our nation's founding. And so when we say America was founded as a Christian nation, that's really what we mean. That's what I mean, because the founding of America makes no sense unless you understand the role that Christianity played.
So what originally, I guess, drew your attention to this topic?
I grew up as a patriot, right? Loving America. That's kind of part of my DNA. I remember the 2008 election, and I was 11 or 12 years old. And so I was, interested in politics and whatnot from a very early age. And so that's something that's just part of me, part of my worldview and how I see the world is just this gratitude that I have to live in this amazing nation that we have. And, we're not perfect. We have our problems. We've had our problems since the very beginning. But, you talk to other people, especially immigrants who have come to this country, and they'll say, wow, America is a special place where you can make something of yourself, where you can live in freedom without fear. And a lot of those things come from the very distinctly Christian founding that we had. And then, we just celebrated America's 250th birthday. And so I really wanted to do something special. I had this idea actually a couple of years ago, but really, again, to look at the impact that Christianity had upon our nation's founding as kind of a celebration of America. In the film, we quote a colleague of mine, Tim Gagelein, who talks about people referring to the 250th anniversary of America as a commemoration, right, which kind of is a solemn term. But really, he said, I reject that entirely. This is a celebration of America. We need times to celebrate the great country that we have, and then to participate in different activities. As we saw, there was 850,000 fireworks that were shot off in Washington, D.C., which was pretty remarkable. I watched those, from Colorado Springs, where I live. Unfortunately, we're in a bit of a drought, so we had no fireworks at all, which I'm a little bitter about, but I think I'll get over at some point. But no, America has a great history, and I really wanted to make this film, Faith in America, to talk about that and to really celebrate our nation and our nation's founding.
All throughout history, we've had nations defined by religion. We have had nations defined by race. How would you define the American identity, and what role do you think Christianity played in shaping that?
Yeah, there's several strands of thought that you can look at in terms of how Christianity has shaped and impacted America's founding. And one is just from the Declaration of Independence, which we just celebrated the 250th anniversary of the signing of it. And You have to understand first, going back even before 1776, we talk about this in the documentary, where you have to go back really to 1607, when 105 English settlers crossed the Atlantic Ocean and came to the shores of America, right on Chesapeake, Virginia. First thing that they did when they arrived here with Reverend Hunt, who led them as their chaplain, he was an ordained minister with the Church of England. They got off the ship, they bowed their heads, and they prayed, and they asked God to bless their efforts to share the gospel in a new nation and a new land. And then they established a cross right there on the shores of Cape Henry. And there's actually a memorial called the Cape Henry Memorial. And there's a cross right there that's established. It might be on a military base, but right there memorializing that event, the founding of America from settlers crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And the very first thing that they do is thank God for getting them here and asking him to bless their efforts to bring the gospel here. So that was 1607. And then just 13 years later, we have the Pilgrims in 1620, crossing again the Atlantic Ocean, trying to seek to live out their faith apart from the official Church of England. They were separatists from the Church of England, but they were really seeking religious freedom and religious liberty and the ability to practice their faith in God apart from the established church. And so going back to those dates, that kind of laid the groundwork for the colonies, for the Christian faith, Judeo-Christian faith that many of the colonists had between that time and the founding of America. And so because of that, when we arrive at the time of the founding in 1776, Christian ideas, Christian philosophy is very well known. There was a study done by Donald Lutz in I believe it was the 20th century. He did a study and found that the Bible was the most cited source among the founding fathers during the time of the founding. It wasn't Enlightenment philosophy. It wasn't different English thinkers. It was Holy Scripture that played a role in shaping their thoughts, their ideas, and then also just how they spoke. A lot of the phrases and cadences that they used in their spoken word and in their writing, those were also often shaped and molded by Scripture, or even direct references or allusions to Scripture. But then again, going back to the Declaration of Independence, we find right there in the very beginning that our rights come from God and not from government. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where does that idea come from? It comes from Genesis chapter 1, where we find that all men and women are created in the image of God, and we have this unique identity as human beings that puts us far above, different animals and other creatures that exist. We have this unique identity as people made in God's image, and the rights that we have come and flow directly from that. That idea that we find right there in the beginning of the Declaration comes straight from Genesis chapter 1. It says that these rights are self-evident, right? That's kind of like they're obvious. People can understand this and know this no matter where they are. But that's not really true across different cultures, across different nations, but it is true of the United States. And why is that? It goes back again to the distinctly Christian founding that we had and the role that Christians played in shaping and forming our nation up until 1776, going back to the time of the English settlers and the Pilgrims.
Historians might point to the Enlightenment as the more prominent influence that prompted the development of Republican government in the United States. How much do you think did the Enlightenment, like the secular Enlightenment, influence the United States founding versus the Christian roots of the country?
Yeah, well, we certainly don't want to say that none of them were coming from the Enlightenment. I don't think that would be accurate. These were, if you've ever seen Thomas Jefferson's library, it's kept at the Library of Congress right there in Washington, D.C., and you walk through that library, and the amount of books in his library is absolutely stunning. I mean, it's probably 20 feet around. It's kind of in a circle. And, he and the other founding fathers drew on a lot of different sources in their establishment of the Republic. But again, I think we have to look back at again, the study that Donald Lutz did and found that Scripture was by far and away, again, the number one resource in the founding of our country, the primary document that the founding fathers drew from and referenced in their debates over the kind of country that we should have. Especially when, the Declaration is being written, some of the reason that, it uses theological language and talks about God, I think 5 different times in the document, is because it was going to be published in newspapers. That's one spot. But the other place it was going to be published was it was going to be sent all across the colonies to be read in churches, right? And so they used theological and religious language because they knew that's who their audience was going to be. They knew that Christian people far and wide were going to be reading this document. And so, again, you can't understand the founding of America and the founding of our nation without understanding the singular role that Christianity had. And then also, you think of the founding fathers, and what they really didn't want to do was have a kind of a French-style revolution where anarchy reigns supreme and justice becomes a matter of bloodshed and things like that. They wanted to have a new nation that was founded on liberty and rights, but then also justice and equality. And the reason for that, again, is because these individuals are shaped by and large by Christian thinking, by Christian ideas, and many of them, again, were Orthodox and firmly Christian believers.
I understand the first Great Awakening that happened sometime, I think, in the early 18th century was pretty formative, not just of the religious life in the colonies, but also that it helped shape their ideas of government and in some ways prompted the willingness to go to war to defend their rights and their system of government that they had enjoyed for so long. What can you tell us about the First Great Awakening and its effect on the colonies?
Yeah, I mean, the Great Awakening's very formative in the establishment of our nation and kind of in the establishment of evangelicalism, and the firm evangelical fervor that marked those times. And I actually just watched a great movie on this topic called A Great Awakening. And if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it. Actually, Hollywood can make good movies every once in a while, and this was one of those good movies that I saw recently, looking at the friendship that Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield, kind of the leader of the Great Awakening, had. And, Ben Franklin, wasn't probably the most ethical or moral person. But then you go to the time of Constitutional Convention, and after weeks of debate and very little progress, you had Ben Franklin. He was the one who, at the time of crisis during the Constitutional Convention in 1787, debating these ideas and thoughts and how we're going to develop this new nation, he paused and he said, we have to ask God for his help and pray. And he said that if Jesus knows, how many sparrows fall from the sky, how likely is it that a new nation is going to be established without God's providential hand? In other words, very unlikely that this God of history who intervenes in the affairs of men, who causes the lilies to grow, right? All straight from the language from the Gospels. How likely is it that this thing is going to succeed if God doesn't help us in this task? Again, the fervor that many Christians had at the time of the founding comes a lot from the Great Awakenings that were experienced and the ramifications of that. And then you have different founding fathers like Samuel Adams, John Jay, for example. These are men of faith. They're Orthodox Christians from what we can tell. And then you have George Washington, who also believed himself to, I would say, be a professing Christian. And there's different moments that you can look at in his life to say, wow, this man who's been called, I think, by one of his biographers, the indispensable man. And I think that that's right, because he was indispensable in the time of the Revolution, leading the colonies to success. Without him, we don't have a nation. We don't have an American nation. And so he became president, thankfully, because he played that important role in the development of our nation in the time of the Revolution. But he called for the establishment of the Chaplains Corps, actually, I believe in 1777, writing to the Continental Congress saying, hey, we need to establish a specific Chaplains Corps for the military, because he knew that the spiritual health of our troops was very important during the time of the Revolution, and that continues today. I think the Chaplains Corps today is the oldest branch of the military, and so you see the legacy of Washington calling for that continuing even today. And then there's obviously the famous painting of him praying at Valley Forge, because again he knew the importance of faith. He considered himself a Christian. He was molded by it. And then also, I think for Washington, you have to look at his decision after serving 2 terms as president to go back to his home in Virginia and say, I could be president for the rest of my life if I wanted to. There's, not to criticize anybody in particular, but there's a lot of politicians today who love lifetime service essentially in Congress. And that's kind of their career. It's their vocation. It's what they do for decades on end. But that's not how Washington saw it. He said, this is something that I'm going to do as almost a burden, a service to my country. I'm going to serve for 2 terms, 8 years, and then go back to my home in Virginia And he had the humility to do that. And why does he have that humility? I think, again, because humility is such an important Christian virtue, and he's shaped and molded by the Christian faith that was so prevalent at the time of the Revolution.
Well, my guest today is Zach Mettler. He is the issues analyst or analyst and writer for Focus on the Family's Daily Citizen. It's interesting to me that even among those who we probably could not say that they were believers, nevertheless, still had kind of like a religious framework as just a matter of perhaps pragmatism. Do you think there's something to be said about like Christians finding unity and just exhorting people to be like, hey, this is just who we are as a country. We are a religious people. This is how we're going to operate. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think you're touching on something really important, and that is that, the freedoms that we have, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to quote the Declaration. But then you look at the Bill of Rights, our freedom to freely practice our religion. That's one of the, it is in the very First Amendment to the Constitution, that we have this right to freely practice our faith, because they knew that was so important. I really do think that is a kind of a crucial element. And for those of us today who, I am a Christian, but for those who aren't Christians, the reason that they have the ability to practice their faith or lack thereof, again, is because of the First Amendment and the result that came from their debates over the Constitution, from the Christian framework that we had at the time of the founding. And I think, especially understanding this and really thinking about it is really important, because we had the Rededicate 250 event at the National Mall. I think that was in May 17th, if I recall correctly. But after that event, there was a host on MS Now named Katie Tur, and she came on and she was talking about this event, and she was covering Mike Johnson's prayer. Mike Johnson had prayed, we believe and pray to you, O God, who is the giver of our rights, knowing that our rights come from you and not from government. That was his prayer. And then you had host Katie Tur come on and say, what about this quote from Mike Johnson saying that our rights come from God and not from government? Is this him putting God over the Declaration of Independence? And for anybody who knows, again, any semblance of the Declaration of Independence, he wasn't putting God over the Declaration of Independence. He was quoting from it, because in the Declaration it says our rights come from God and not from government. And so I think there's a profound ignorance, if you will, of American history, of the importance that Christianity played in the time of the founding among a lot of our media, academia, elected officials, many of our institutions, different nonprofit organizations, secular nonprofit organizations. There's many who want to ignore the Christian history and are ignorant of our Christian history. And so I think it's really up to us to have these kinds of conversations and to know this history, because I like to quote Ronald Reagan, freedom is only one generation away from its extinction, right? And so if we're not going to be the ones to talk about this, if we're not going to learn about it and know it, then the next generation is even less likely to do so. And so I think it's very important, especially as we approach the time of, or have celebrated the time of America's founding and the 250th celebration of America, to really consider these things and to remind ourselves of our history, to know more and more about our history, and just have a passion for learning about it, because we all live in this great constitutional republic, and it's up to us to be good citizens of that republic and to do our duty as citizens, to give back to our country and to love her in that way.
As we've gotten away from some of those faith roots and have become an increasingly secular and atheistic country, in what ways do you think our rights, our political sensibilities have also been formed by that shift away from religion?
Yeah, it's a very interesting time to be a Christian in America, because you see kind of the decline of the mainline denominations, right? I think of the Presbyterian, Methodist denominations, especially kind of the liberal segments of those denominations, the Episcopal denomination. These denominations are in absolute free fall in terms of membership, in terms of church participation. And so I think that has kind of led to this perception, and I don't think it's entirely incorrect, that there is this decline of Christianity in our country, because you do see, again, these denominations that have a great history really in free fall, in decline. But at the same time, I think, if you go on any Sunday to a typical evangelical conservative church, you're going to be there with a lot of friends, a lot of people. And so you have kind of this especially even conservative Catholics, conservative Protestants. These churches are, I think, gaining membership. They're growing. And so it's an interesting time to be a Christian in America because, again, you're right, self-identification of Christians is falling. But on the ground, the Holy Spirit, I believe, is still at work. And so if you go to a church on Sunday that's moderate to conservative, I think you're going to find yourself in good company with a lot of other people. But you're right, especially among a lot of our elite class, there is a decline in Christianity, specific sectors of the nation, different states. I live in Colorado, a very liberal state. Colorado Springs is a little bit to the opposite of that, but for the most part, yeah, Colorado has gone in a very poor direction. And we have seen a lot of threats on religious liberty as a result. We've had the Colorado Civil Rights Commission go after Christian Baker. I've met him several times, Jack Phillips, trying to seek to force him to violate his faith and create several cakes, actually one for a same-sex wedding. Thankfully, that was rejected by the Supreme Court. But then we had another lawsuit. I think it was the third lawsuit against him by Autumn Scardina, a transgender identified lawyer from Denver who tried to force Jack to make a cake that was pink on the outside and blue on the inside, I believe, to celebrate their gender transition. And so you have, I think, and then thankfully that was eventually struck down by the Colorado Supreme Court. And we also just had a recent case from Kaylee Childs holding her right to counsel minors who are struggling with unwanted same-sex attraction or sexual identity confusion. Colorado had passed a law saying that if you're going to counsel minors struggling with these issues, the only thing that you can do and the only thing that you can say, mandating the speech of these counselors, is to direct them and guide them towards homosexuality and towards transgenderism. That's the only conversations that you can have for them. If you're going to try to talk with them, and that's all we're talking about is talk therapy. If you're going to try to speak with them, try to investigate those underlying causes and different things that might have contributed in some way to homosexual desires or a confusion over the sexual identity, you can't have those conversations. That is illegal for you to do so, and we will shut you down if you do. And so there's different threats that we are seeing all across the country, especially in blue quarters, to religious freedom. And I think, that is in part kind of a sad reflection upon the state of our nation today. But thankfully, there's great groups like Alliance Defending Freedom that have come to the defense of Christians and said, no, these rights that you have that were present at the time of the American founding haven't changed. The Constitution hasn't changed. And so we're going to defend your right absolutely to practice your faith in accordance with your religious beliefs, and to be able to do that. For us at the Daily Citizen, where I write for, we talk about these issues on a daily basis, trying to keep people informed about where our culture is at. We talk about life, religious freedom, free speech, homosexuality, transgenderism, marriage, parenting, family, education. There's a lot that we talk about that are generally not good news, but we always try to provide a positive perspective on it to the extent that we can, because I think there's a lot of good people doing a lot of good stuff all across the country. And so I'm grateful to be able to participate in that way.
I am also reminded of, I don't know how prominent this is anymore, because there have been a lot of, I think, Supreme Court cases that have continuously upheld First Amendment rights. But the debate of the separation of church and state, historically, at least, in the last, I don't know how many years, we've understood that to mean that our Christian faith has no relevance whatsoever in public life. What would the founders have thought about that?
Well, I think if you asked a lot of Americans, where do you find the phrase separation of church and state? I think a lot of them would say, the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, and they would be wrong, because if you read the Constitution, you read the Bill of Rights, there is no phrase separation of church and state in any of those documents. The phrase separation of church and state comes from Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. And he was talking about how they should be absolutely free to practice their religion and not feel burdened or like an overbearing federal government was going to come in and interfere with their practice of religion. That was the origin of separation of church and state. That phrase comes from Thomas Jefferson. But a lot of people, I think, again, twist that and say Christians can't get involved in politics, or if you're going to get involved in politics as a Christian, keep your faith in your home. As soon as you leave your home and you go to the ballot box, or you go somewhere else, you go to City Hall and you're an elected official, well, then you're creating a theocracy if you're going to allow your theology to influence your political views. And that's just not true. All of us have a theological bent of some sort, theological persuasion, and everybody allows that to influence their political views, influence their worldview in some way. And so Christians absolutely do not have to check out of politics because of their faith. They don't have to leave their faith at the front door when they're going to go vote. Everybody should take their faith and their beliefs into the ballot box with them as they seek to try to build a better nation and elect politicians who are going to reflect their values. So I think that's something to keep in mind and is very important. And something we explore in the film Faith in America is really the important moment of that today, especially. You have Os Guinness, who's been warning us kind of that we're in this civilizational moment, as he says, that there's really three options before us. One is that we recommit to these ideals that we've been talking about, the Christian founding of our country, inalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit, and happiness. Those things, that's one option for us to kind of recommit to our nation's founding principles. Another option is for us to be rooted in something else entirely. You think of the rise of Islam or secularism today. That's an option. There's many different stories of kind of the rise of Islam today. I think that's something that should certainly concern us. Or we can die. We can die as a civilization. He says those are your three options. And we spoke with in the documentary Michelle Bachmann, who ran for president in 2012. We spoke with Dr. A.J. Nolte of Regent University, just an amazing man, an amazing scholar. Again, Tim Gegeline, who is my colleague here at Focus, and then some other individuals as well. And Dr. Nolte said, given the extraordinary history that we have as Americans, the clear option and the firm option before us is to recommit to our nation's founding principles, to recommit to our nation's founding ideals, and to kind of resurrect and recommit to those founding principles that we find in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And that's going to be the best way for us to flourish as a nation. And so I'd encourage everybody to do one thing really, to really recommit ourselves to our founding principles, whether that's registering to vote for the first time, whether that's going to vote in upcoming elections. We have elections just a few months away. Whether it's subscribing to the Daily Citizen, where I write for, so that you're informed on the different topics of the day. There's different things that you can do to get involved and to get engaged, and I think that's really important for us to do today.
What do you think are the most important lessons that Christians should take from America's religious history?
Yeah, I think we explore this also in the documentary, that Christians uniquely have a contribution to make to American politics today, because we come from a faith that, again, values humility, which values self-sacrifice and love. And so when we talk about issues, again, I mentioned the different issues that we cover at the Daily Citizen. A lot of those are hot topics. They're contentious. They can cause a lot of heat. We try to provide light. But as Christians, we can provide something unique in our political discourse today, and that's speaking the truth in love, right? Following the example of our Savior, Jesus Christ. And by doing that, we allow our country to have really difficult, crucial conversations in a way that doesn't involve violence, doesn't involve bloodshed. Unfortunately, we've seen that, in the past year or so, especially with Charlie Kirk's assassination. I think it's really more important now than ever for Christians to be involved in politics and providing that common moral framework of involvement, of speaking truth in love, that Christians can provide today. And so I'd encourage every Christian who's listening to really take it upon themselves to say, now is the time when I'm going to get engaged. Now is the time when I'm going to get involved, and to do one thing to do that, I think is a great thing.
You've been listening to His People on Pilgrim Radio. Many thanks to our guest, Zach Mettler, a writer and issues analyst for the Daily Citizen and narrator of the new short film, Faith in America. If you'd like to watch it, go to dailycitizen.focusonthefamily.com. On tomorrow's program, it's Obi Tyler Todd on the influential theology of Jonathan Edwards' religious affections.
I think it was Gerald McDermott at Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham. He said that Edwards frames the human heart like an airport. Everyone's going somewhere. And that's really the human affections. We should not conceive of the heart as if there's some kind of neutrality when we reach or approach certain things. The human heart is not neutral. The human heart is not static. It's not dead. we love things and we hate things. We desire things and we despise things. But even hatred is misplaced love.
That's tomorrow at the same time, right here on His People. Thanks for listening.